Now, OMFIF was created as a result of a whole series of somewhat random, haphazard events and ideas collected at the time, more than 10 years ago, as a result of a rather odd, spontaneous collection of conversations with friends, colleagues, people I've known for many years. Many of you are assembled here in the room tonight. I'm particularly indebted to DZ Bank of Germany, represented here by the reassuring presence of Frank Scheidig, and also to Oscar Lewison from the well-known firm with another catchy name of Suditik. Both of you have been very helpful in putting on the festivities tonight, and you've also been around very much since the beginning. I would like to pay particular tribute to the absolutely spellbinding, wonderful OMFIF staff, of whom I'm really very, very proud. I couldn't imagine a more hard-working, talented bunch of people to work with. And I'd like to say a big thank you also just to 4 people who have been particularly helpful and intense in today's preparations. There is Marcin Stepan, who's organized a lot of what's going on tonight and also tomorrow's seminar, as well as Ben Rands and Helen Gibson. And I'd also like to say thank you to a man who's called the head of publications, called Simon Hadley, who's not here tonight because he's looking after his 2-year-old son. But I mention those people because they are symptomatic of the wonderful hard work that people put in. I'd also like to mention here just briefly Michael Lafferty, with whom I started this 10 years ago, partner in crime, and we should remember him as well. He's not here tonight. There are many other figures who have been supporting us over the years here tonight. Jacques de la Rosière, Otmar Issing, Niels Tugersen, just to mention 3. The word legendary is not amiss for people, friends like that. Thank you very much indeed for making the trip here tonight. Now, a central bank with decisive influence over OMFIF's early years was the Deutsche Bundesbank, a bank which used to raise ire by raising interest rates, now provokes considerable unrest, at least in Germany, with negative ones. So how times change. And of course, all this is rather minor compared with the polarization in our own country, which I hope now will be past as a result of the troubles over leaving the European Union. I do hope we can get beyond that. Now, a decade for some, it has flown by. It does seem to have been for me. It's an old saying, 10 years are but as yesterday when it is past and a watch in the night. Some others harbor different feelings about that span of time. I won't exactly say who she is, but I would like to say, from the bottom of my heart, Veronica, well done and thank you very much for all the support. Now, a quick remark about the company's name. It is, as many have said, the worst possible acronym of all time. But it seems to have caught on. A combination of the IMF, FIFA, and Omerta, the Italian curse of silence, or the German OMFIF, when you kick off a football game. Well, we've kicked off quite a bit over the last 10 years. We've headed in a few goals. We've scored a few successes. Speaking to you in a few minutes will be Wolfram Seidermann, the CEO of G&D, Giesecke & Devrient, Currency Technology, who's going to be talking about trust in payments, which will occupy you at least for a few minutes. Zeti Aziz, another old friend and great supporter. Dr. Zeti, thank you so much for being here, who was so remarkably helpful when we started up 10 years ago, the former governor of Bank Negara Malaysia, now heading the pension fund PNB, owning large swathes of the London property scene, including Battersea Power Station She will be talking. And then also John Orchard, who's just joined us as our new CEO. And now, to start off with, there's somebody who is something of a household name, a man who's been a great source of inspiration and wisdom over the years, brimming with bearded bonhomie and perpetually providing prescient perceptiveness, all the P's, a man who's well known for you, the former head of economics at the European Central Bank, a man still with his finger on the pulse. I give you Peter Praet.
Lady first. Thank you. I don't know why I'm here, actually. On the podium, I mean. In the room, I would prefer, in a way, to be in the room and not on the podium, David. So thank you very much. And I'm very touched by that. And I still wonder why. And maybe you will wonder why after having listened to me. So what did I prepare? 10 years ago, we still had illusions that normality would come back, that business as usual would come back. In 2010, you remember, we had a strong recovery, and we were working, and the ECB was even increasing rates in 2011-12, in 11 twice, but the idea was basically the return to normality. That's one point. The second point is that we had in 2009 a remarkable G20. We had no protectionism, you know, after the big shock we had and the trade collapse we had after Lehman Brothers. We had this, you know, huge cohesion in the G20. When I was younger, before the crisis, very often we said, you know, what's the usefulness of these Gs, 7 or 20? Nobody was reading the communiques and all that. I mean, I didn't, at least, and it started with the G7 when I was still at the university. But at the G20 of the 2009, the end of 2009, you had a big cohesion. There was no trade barriers. There was a coherent policy response in the world. The Americans should not forget that the Chinese spend a lot in fiscal policy to support the economy. Of course, it was also self-interest, but it was also in the collective interest. There was a win-win sort of situation. Then came the euro crisis just after, so very soon. So they lost some of the illusions of normality. But basically, it was the result of two things. First, Great Recession, which of course made imbalances which we had in your area unsustainable. So we had a number of imbalances. Many thought, well, we could, you know, stretch them and buy time, you know, and normalize the situation. With the Great Recession, countries like Italy, for example, Italy didn't have a banking crisis, but the recession, of course, you know, made that the economy was going into deep recession, and then the banking crisis in Italy came later, and the other countries. The point here, the important point here, is that the correction of these imbalances were amplified because of lack of preparation, lack of institutions we had. Crisis management, crisis preparation institution, crisis resolution for banks and sovereigns. So the Monnet, the Jean Monnet doctrine, you know, Europe will be forged in crisis, worked. It worked because we came, you know, head of state met in June. They came with the SSM, the Single Resolution Fund, they came with mechanism, and they came with the ESM. So they brought some institutional response to the problem. And it's only, I think, Mario will agree with that, it's only because of the June that the whatever it takes was efficient. Because the signal that was given by the central bank was backed by institutional reforms that would, you know, guarantee that it was not just waste money. We will discuss that tomorrow about, you know, these sort of actions from the central bank. My interpretation is that it was key, these institutional reforms were key to make a success of the whatever it takes of Mario. It was a necessary conditions. Some people say he should have acted before. I think he acted after there was this big commitment from head of state and government. That was a second shock. The third shock, and the adjustment, as you know, was brutal in the area. What is the most amazing for me is that with this bad functioning of the monetary union, because of the, you know, weak institutional framework that we had, that the support for the euro is so strong and has increased. It fell, of course, in the crisis, but it's still at a very high level today. In a way, it's a success. It's very surprising, because you could argue that given what we lived and some countries lived through, it could be much, much worse than what we have seen. So I think this is absolutely successful. The third shock came with the Chinese. I call it the Chinese shock, which was 15, the summer of 15, the Shanghai shock. I call it personally the rebalancing shock of China, 15, 16. But here again, you got a G20 response. I remember pretty well that period. And you had in early 16, the G20, you had a coherent response. We can discuss, if it's good or not. The three-pronged approach, you had monetary, fiscal, and structural reforms. But there was a coherent response to the G20, and actually it worked. There was a big rebound of the world economy in the second half of 16, was surprising. And if you look at the euro area, we had three engines. We had lower oil prices at that time, which provided a big boost, for the households. You had a very accommodative monetary policy, even more than before. And you had also the external demand, which was recovering very rapidly at that time. So that was the second one. Again, you had a coherent response. The G20 played a very big role. It was a sort of coordinated response to these issues. Then that's number four. That's number four, David. And we are still in the decade. It's incredible when I think about it. When people say monetary policy doesn't work, I don't understand why people say that. We had a sequence of shocks, and I think it worked. The fourth shock, my criticism on monetary policy will come at the end. The fourth shock, yes, but now that I left, the fourth shock is what we call now politely the geopolitical shock, of course. And that's a different nature, I think. It's much more difficult. I'm not convinced that monetary policy can do a lot about these sort of shocks. Because basically the sort of geopolitical shocks that we have create sort of systemic uncertainty. What is the trade regime, and things like this. Can you counter this by monetary policy accommodation? I think financial shocks, banking crisis, I think there, yes, liquidity provision, monetary accommodations are very important things. I think for geopolitical shocks, I'm not sure at all that monetary policy is an appropriate response. I think, what can the central bank do? Now, of course, they can try to support, the equity prices by trying to cut the denominator, the discount rate, while the numerator is weakening, is full of uncertainties. But it's a very dangerous game, of course, because at the end of the day, what will count is the numerator. I mean, the fundamentals, basically. So that's the geopolitical shock. I think it's of a different nature. Basically, the origin of the shock, I think, but that's for discussion, it's basically the consequence of intra-country regional disparities. I think that has been explained very well in the last WEO of the IMF. I think that was the last one, which I think is a very interesting way because it changed very much the political spectrum in a number of countries, depending also of the voting system, because the same story happened also in France, but the voting system made, that the majority went to the other part, not the more populist part. But I think the geopolitical shock has some of the origin in the intra-regional disparities, which change very much the political spectrum, also in the UK, of course. And that's very difficult. So you have a new environment, which is very different from the three previous one I described, which is more an environment of zero-sum game, no cooperation, power games, and it's a very different thing. So I consider that as a key regime change. Maybe proof or not proof, I found it very interesting today when Christine Lagarde made a speech in Paris today that she mentioned in a speech which was, I would call it qualified a rather political speech, but I think, but it's very significant from this new environment. She called for an ambition of building European autonomy. European autonomy. That's new in the language. European autonomy. But she cleverly added, as a complement to global cooperation, of course, as a complement to global cooperation, but a European autonomy. And that brings me back when I was young, graduated from the university at the Institute of European Studies, all the arguments we used for European integration was precisely to say, in a world with small open economies in the world and some big players, you need to be strong. You need to be strong. You need to create your internal market because, you know, free markets, you know, are an abstraction. It depends on your value, your culture, and all this. And so you create your internal market, and in the external relation, you will be strong via your foreign trade policy. You can influence international norms and all that. And Europe always was both of that. We were global, so we wanted to liberalize. We wanted to do it in an orderly way. But at the same time, we also worked very much in international organization. If you look at the GATT, which I was teaching many years ago before the WTO, there's the GATT, the most favored nation clause was precisely that. And the reciprocity in the reduction of barriers to exchanges, to trade, in the reduction, not in the levels of barriers, were two key principles of the GATT, which now are totally, you know, well, contested, especially, I mean, in the United States, I would say, basically. So that brings us to monetary policy again. I think monetary policy has played a key role in supporting the economies in very difficult circumstances. I say the forced shock, I'm not convinced that it's really useful. We can debate on this. I think it's a different sort of shock. But the issue I think we will discuss certainly in the next 10 years, but also tomorrow, is that there is a perception in the population of a very powerful institution today. A powerful institution which of course can afford in Europe to buy more than 2 trillion by money creation, which shows to the public that it has a high spending capacity. And so in the public, of course, when you open a strategic debate on this issue, it is clear, I see Patrick Honohan there, that the QE for the people, of course, will be on the agenda, of course, and that's coming. Now, the other issue, a powerful institution, it's, of course, when I was educated and when I entered central bank 20 years ago, it was central bank has to be modest, they should not be in the public and should be careful about not becoming politicians. So I think all that discussion about powerful institution is something that I must say worries me because the central bank can only do so much, and in some situations I don't think central bank can do very much. Basically, it must be supported by the other policies. And that's what we had usually. The other policies were not sufficiently supporting from monetary policy. And at some points, you know, something has to give in, and we will see what give in. I hope it will be the politicians coming with reforms, or the central bank will be on the other side. So these 10 years, next 10 years, I mean, these will be the debates. And congratulations, Mark. All the team, congratulations, David, and all the team. Mark is there too, huh? Yes. You know that we are sitting in a group on central bank transparency for the IMF, and we do that on with Telecom. Huh?
Yes. Well, first of all, let me also, it's my distinct honor to congratulate OMFIF on the occasion of its 10th anniversary. In fact, it was my privilege to have attended the very first event that OMFIF organized, and that was in Frankfurt at the Deutsche Bundesbank. And now 10 years have gone by, and I've watched OMFIF evolve on many fronts. The geographical outreach, it started in Europe, then rapidly extended its business into Asia, into ASEAN, and then now to the US. And then in terms of its participation, it has been extremely inclusive in terms of from the developed world to the emerging world. And also, who mattered was always involved in terms of the central bank, the market makers, the institutional investors, and there was always a great engagement. And on the issues, OMFIF has been a leader in highlighting and at the frontier in highlighting the issues that are important confronting the international financial system. So OMFIF has provided an important neutral platform for dialogue in our more complex and highly interconnected world. And what is important in this new era that we are entering into, where there's greater uncertainty, greater scrutiny, certainly of everyone, not just of the central bank, but of the private sector as well, and demands for greater transparency and greater expectation. There needs, and also in terms of the greater interconnectivity that exists. And therefore, what is central in all this is greater engagement. There has to be a greater understanding and appreciation of the functioning of the whole system, and therefore the role of OMFIF in all this is more important than ever before. So we look forward to the next few decades, and congratulations again to OMFIF. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, David, thank you very much for the opportunity to address the audience with a topic of incredible social-political relevance: money. The question today is, in the age of digital transformation, what is the future of payment and what is the payment of the future? OMFIF turns 10, rather young, I guess, for an organization focusing on finance and money, since the concept of money already started over 10,000 years ago. Communities used shells, grains, and stones as tangible tokens and units of account, exchange, and store of value. And the history of central banks, the guardians of stable and solid currencies, some of which are here tonight, already began in the 17th century. In 1609, the Amsterdam City Council decided to put an end on the chaos of over 800 different coins and established the Amsterdamsche Wisselbank, which, mandated by the City Council, established an efficient, standardized currency cycle. Central banks have been managing currencies in all aspects very competently ever since. They have been continuously optimizing their currency cycles, employing the latest technology available and pushing their suppliers to provide the innovations necessary to maintain a state-of-the-art system. Their technological expertise has greatly contributed to building the trust in government-issued currency as it exists today. Coins were complemented very early on by bank accounts, paper banknotes, cards, and now by online payments and mobile phones. But only cash as the sovereign payment, public payment instrument fulfills the requirement of the public. Independent from any additional technology, easy and universally in use, guaranteeing full financial and social inclusion with no entry hurdles. A truly democratic means of payment that provides huge value to any society. However, with all its benefits, cash does not work in the digital world. Looking at this huge transformation the world is experiencing today, where more and more business models go fully digital, the question arises, how can we, or rather how can central banks, transfer the benefits of cash, and especially its characteristic as a public good, into the digital world? We have been discussing this with many talks, with many OMFIF roundtables. Many of the questions raised there were reflected in the study that OMFIF presented today, which centers on trust and the mandate central banks have for issuing currency also in a digital format. There's no doubt the shell, grain, and stones of the internet community, cryptocurrency, such as Bitcoin and co, are not a solution. Neither is Facebook's Libra, which is why government-issued central bank digital currency has become a hot topic. And, as outlined earlier, central banks are well equipped and tech-savvy enough to not only offer the most solid, trusted digital solution, but also the coolest and most convenient. They are the technology leaders if it comes to currency. Indeed, many central banks are already looking at it, doing research, or have even started pilots. And my hypothesis is the risk of doing nothing is higher than to engage into that journey and maintain control. We at Giesecke & Devrient, supplier in the currency industry, have been studying since a decade with central bank customers the virtualization of banknotes and have been offering support for this transformational journey. The future begins today. It's our responsibility to design it in a way that all groups in a society feel at home in it. Fair, democratic, inclusive, secure, government payment system, currency as a public good is an important element for this future. Looking at the survey, the public would appreciate greater visibility and more leadership of central banks when it comes to transferring cash into the digital space. Thank you, David and team. Thank you for facilitating this dialogue, and happy anniversary.
Thank you, Wolfram. Quiet at the back, please. I'm taking you through a 30-slide PowerPoint deck on my plans for OMFIF. No, I'm not. It's all on one slide, yeah. First observation is they really have fixed the air conditioning here. This room used to overstate the temperature outside by a lot, and it seems not to do that anymore. So you're very lucky. It's freezing outside. Anyway, only a couple of remarks to make on my behalf. I'm very proud to have taken on the mantle that David has recruited me for. I'd say when I was a child, finance ministries told central banks what to do. I think most of you can remember that. Now I'm middle-aged, it's the other way round, as Peter was just saying. And I'm sure when I retire, it'll have moved back again. Needless to say, OMFIF will carry on cultivating the links with all the key actors and proudly facilitate the conversation amongst you. I'm a recent outsider to OMFIF. Before this, I was at Euromoney for many years. Many of you will know it, where, among other things, I ran the magazine. And at OMFIF, I've been immediately struck by the maturity of the discussion in private between central banks and private financial institutions, which is very reassuring, I think. I come from a place where none of those actors would ever say anything interesting or useful on the record, especially about one another, and it's nice to see that they do in private. We all understand the dangers of that dialogue breaking down, and OMFIF will do what it can to sustain it. I've spent a long time in and around capital markets too, and it's interesting to watch central banks move towards them and central banks move towards capital markets. We'll watch that very closely too and facilitate the discussion. I know in your shoes I can see already that you're looking around for the champagne waiter. I know I would be. So I'm going to let you get on with drinking and talking to friends. Suffice to say, I look forward to working with you. I've got good plans for OMFIF. Come and talk to me in private about what they are over drinks. I'm very much looking forward to working with the team and David. But most of all, I'd like to toast you, to toast us. Have a lovely evening. Thank you very much.